Well, hello there, this is Shane from Shane's Books and Review, and I hope you are having a great day today. And it is Friday, we've made it through the week, that's awesome. Today's book is going to be Armor, which was wrote by John Steakley. Now, is this book worth your time, worth your energy? Let's find out. Typically, stories have a structure, and it's a structure that's been used for a very, very long time. It's the 3-act structure. We'll have a character, we'll get to know them, we'll find out what their hopes, dreams, aspirations kind of are during that introduction phase. Then we will come across a problem that they have to surmount and get past. Then afterwards, we find out how the fallout is and how it changed them forever. It's really a loose paraphrase of the 3-act structure, but this book is best thought of in that way. It really kind of could be separated out into 3 short stories. The first one has to do with Felix, the second one has to do with Jack Crow, and the last one has to do with Lewis and Jack Crow. Lewis, this fisherman character that we fall in love with, and the story is kind of disjointed in a way, but it was good storytelling for this reason. Whenever you typically have a story, everything is going to be really laid out in front of you. I've not read anything from John Steakley before, so I don't know if this is like a common MO of his. It was really interesting because the first story seemed completely not related to the second story, and we'll get into that in a second. The third story, the conclusion of the book, as everything was wrapping up, it didn't seem like it had anything to do with the first story either. Now, there were tie-ins from the first story to the middle part of the book, and as far as the last part of the book, it seemed like everything that Jack had done had come back to bite him in a way, but here it is. So because of that was a thing that was the most intriguing to me about the book. As I mentioned in the previous video, whenever I first started to read this book, it was during a time period where I was in a time period where I was reading a lot of books about, well, immortal soldier type of a phenomenon. Those books I find very interesting because how would we survive as humans if we lived forever? I mean, it's an interesting question. It's an interesting debate for sure. There's scientific postulations, really, where the human mind could only last for about maybe 200 years. And then it would fall apart. Even if the container, its vessel, was completely healthy, our mental stuff would just fall apart, is what they're guessing. Of course, if we got to the point where we had a body we could put our brain in, our soul, our mind, our conscious, then maybe we could renew that resource and it could work forever. But anyway, that's not a question of when does humans stop being human. It's a question of what would we do psychologically as humans if we knew that there was no penalty for death? How would we behave? Would we stay in the same structures as we are now, the same type of hierarchies, etc.? That was the reason why I was reading all those books. With that digression to the side, it was just an interesting thing and a cool little thought experiment that I was kind of working through because it was fun. That was the reason why I picked up Armor. Some of the things that were like these little splash reviews, little 1 and 2 sentence paragraphs, which really aren't paragraphs, but anyway, they kind of alluded that this book was that same thing, and it's not. It's not that kind of a book at all. There is some hints throughout the book that this Felix character, he wouldn't be one that dies. And you get this sense of a grand scale when you're reading it because, this is happening, but it's really not. From what I could gather from the book, everything that was in the book happened within maybe a 6 or 8 year span, I think. So it's not that the character Felix was actually indeed immortal. He just had an extreme knack for not dying. So in the first part of the book, we have this character by the name of Felix. And Felix is kind of a rough and a tumble kind of a character, but he's a rough and a tumble kind of a character because he's carrying some baggage, and we don't really get hints of that at all. It's not a stretch of the imagination that somebody that is that determined and that grizzled, they've been through something has happened, and he ends up pulling this scout duty, which is the crap job of the military, really. They get these suits, they have to run, they get less armor, and they get less ammo, and they have to go do these incredible feats. And the story revolves around this character Felix. He gets put into all these really bad situations by his commanders. He ends up having more medical trauma than is actually physical possible on multiple occasions. It's not that he had more damage done to his body than what he could take. It was that apparently there's these rules and regulations saying that once a soldier hits so many major medical traumas, then they need to be released or retired so that they're not psychologically damaged. Poor Felix has had over 20 drops. None of it's gone well. None of it's gone the way that it was supposed to. His entire units have wiped. He's usually the last man standing. The whole reason why he's fighting and he's on this hellhole of a planet by the name of Banshee is that there's these things that humans call ants. They're not really ants, but they have the same amount of legs and they kind of look that way, but they walk around on their back 2 feet like we do. These things are ferocious. They want us dead. We want them dead. They have star travel. Everything is kind of centric to Banshee itself. Now, towards the end of the book, some of the worlds the ants have been, I'm guessing, exterminated on. It really doesn't clarify that much. It does say that they feel like most of that's done with, but it's probably still going on, but just not in that region where they're at. But Felix, he's, instead of getting overwhelmed, like most people do whenever they are attacked by multiple things coming at them at the same time, he stays calm, cool, and collected. There's this thing that's happening inside of his head. He refers to it as the engine. The engine takes over. He's just a massacre machine. With the armored suit and with the weapons that he has, it was kind of a cool story. It was definitely full of testosterone, but there was also other points of it that made it worth reading beyond just the rah, 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 rah. The whole time he has this internal dilemma. He feels like he's not good enough. He just wants to die. He's over it, but he just can't die. That's almost like a running joke inside of the book, because so many people are like, well, why isn't he dead? And the people that know of him, in a way, understand that Felix is one that must be killed. He can't just give up and die. So there's that. Now, towards the end of the first story, it kind of cuts off abruptly. There's a really bad scene. Then we go into the second story, which is about this guy that's not really a pirate, but he calls himself a pirate because he did a lot of research on this Jack Crow. He's a big womanizer. Beyond him being a pirate, not really a good one, really, a good one at all. He ends up meeting up with this individual that takes him to this planet, and he gets dropped there. He gets all kinds of untold amounts of money for it. Well, no, it wasn't untold. It was 24 million credits or something like that. Plus, he gets a ship for his trouble. He ends up on this little researcher place where he gets dropped, essentially just to kind of be like a spy on these people, to go back and forth in between the people and this other pirate that was paying him. Anyway, long of it all is this. Jack Crow part of the story, yeah, that was kind of interesting, but that was the slow part. It really didn't do it for me in a lot of ways. And the reason why is because of, I don't care how suave you think you are. That's not realistic. In these kinds of books, of course, they're not supposed to be realistic. I do expect the relationships and interactions between characters to be somewhat realistic, and that's what I'm getting at. It's just like he shows up and he says his name, and then he's attacked by a mob of women everywhere he goes. That's not really the way it works, beyond that shortcoming of the stories. He does end up, towards the end of the book, getting locked in with one of them. And they're not happy, but they're going to try. But Jack Crow ends up with this researcher, Holly, his lady friend. There's this piece of armor that they start to inspect, and Holly is an incredibly intelligent individual, and if he was a real person, I'd actually kind of like to meet him. Some of the conversations we could have, ooh, that'd be fun. This armor, he finds it belonged to a scout. There's traces of the person still in the armor, which is kind of a weird thing that usually doesn't happen. And so Holly wants to bring him around. Whoever this person was starts to do some research and finds out it was this person by the name of Felix. So there's our tie-in to the first story. Some of the story has to do with Jack Crow going back and forth in between that camp and the pirate camp. Some of the story has to do with Holly investigating this suit. And then in the middle part of the second part of the book, that's where we start to learn more about Felix, because Holly has this breakthrough and figures out how they can all submerge into the reality of that person who was in there. And they find out about these deeds, what Felix had gone through, and they pretty well live his life that was on Banshee in that suit. They go through the triumphs, they go through the pitfalls, but that was a mechanism for us as the reader to find out more about the character of Felix himself. And it is in the second story where we find out where Felix kind of came from, what kind of a background he had, and we find out about that supposed not mentioned baggage was evidently going to be there. Really, really well done. I really enjoyed that part of the story simply because it wasn't about this whole Jack Crow fiasco. I really didn't care so much about that at all. But I did care about the Felix character because he was tortured, he had issues, he just couldn't find who he was or where he was. We find out what happened right there in the middle of it and what had been the soul-crushing blow to him. Regardless of this one scene where he was fighting against these ants, was inside of this tunnel type of a situation, anybody else would have pretty well given up at that point. The ghost is up. It's over. It's done. But the guy has so much grit that he came up with one last thing, and, well, look, he's not dead. And it wasn't done in a way that, oh, it was a miraculous... No, it was a common sense thing. For somebody that has that much willpower to not die, just to give it a chance, because you're going to die anyway, it's not a luck thing in the way that it was wrote. It was a how far down the hole can we go, Little Miss Alice. It was one of those things that was really interesting to see, the mental state of the guy, because it does go back and forth in between his mental state and what he's thinking and what he's doing. And you can fill in the gaps between any of them because it was so well wrote. We get to that end part of the second story, and now we know about why and what happened. And we think that that is the end of Felix. Apparently, the rock star of the military, this person by the name of Kent, which is a most beautiful physical specimen, the best fighters, the best this, and this, and come to find out he's really not. He just wants to be. And that was a touch of reality. That was a nice little snippet of stuff that was put in there by the author. It made it more realistic, especially with the interactions of the people whenever they were talking about him throughout the other parts of the book. So that was well done, well thought out. Whenever we get into the third part of it, Jack has betrayed Holly in a way. Then this pirate guy that was originally paying him, he's going to be taking over this planet. And in the meantime of all this, there's this secondary character that I started to fall in love with. I didn't much care for the Jack Crow story, with the exception of the parts about this character by the name of Lewis. Lewis is a big guy, a loud singer that's completely off key. A complete and total slouch. It's a weird word. Is that even a word? Synthaholic? We don't even have... In the story, there's synthetic alcohol, and so it's synthetic, and that's where I'm getting to synthaholic. There was all kinds of things about his character that was phenomenally awesome, being that one time that there was a problem with the alcohol that they were making, and they didn't have any for a month and a half, and instead of him actually drinking, he just quit until the synthetic alcohol was back. He was celebrating the one fish he caught for years. In his demeanor, there was a fight scene whenever we first got introduced to Lewis and didn't realize that he was the guy that ran the planet and owned the planet pretty much. In that scene, he was calm, cool, collected. He had a big smile on his face. All the kids loved him, were hanging out with him, and this one guy was really upset about things that had happened. And it was during this fight scene where this individual was really mad because apparently Lewis had broke his chance of getting a woman. We find out more and more from that point forward about this Lewis character. He seems to have his own sense of morality, his own sense of justice. He's a very friendly individual, but he also seems to be the sort that you really wouldn't want to mess with and get upset if it would even be possible. There's a few scenes where Jack interacts with Lewis because the first one was completely by happenstance. The second one was more of a let's have a drinking competition. And then there's another point where Lewis finds Jack Crow sitting and talking with someone, and he had, I'm guessing, a glass of wine in his hand, but he's like, look, I'm one of you, I drink. And Lewis was like, nah. He goes, well, what do you think this is then? And he's like, I would take a fake mustache so much more seriously than that drink in your hand, because that's propaganda, or better yet, a prop. There's all kinds of things in that story with Lewis versus Jack Crow, and it was good. Well, not just filler, but getting us more attached to this character. The last part of the book, things have heated up. Now there's pretty much going to be a battle for that planet that they were on with Lewis and Jack Crow and Holly, etc. The issue here is that a band of pirates had come in. Jack was with them. Now there's another guy that's going to be coming in. The whole point of the first guy that was there was he was going to make the living conditions so horrible that this other guy was almost going to look like a saint, but he would use the fear of it all to lock everything down. That was the issue that Jack had with it, and rightfully so. So with this one, I agree with him. On the same token, I think things were drove out of proportion due to egotistical bullcrap. And it was that realism of the conversation between, but I can also see the grandstanding, and so it gets a pass on this one. As far as the little details of this person's mad at this person because of this, and this person feels slighted because of this guy wants to take over it. As mentioned, we know that Lewis was pretty much the owner of the planet. He rented out stuff to the fleet so that they could do their little field test and scientific explorations of the planet, etc. Lewis was understanding of the fleet, but he didn't much like the fleet. And whenever Lewis finds out about the pirates wanting to take over that planet, his reaction wasn't probably what you would think. Instead of getting upset and mad in that true, almost carefree way that he was living, he said he didn't care, he would just give it to him, as long as it was also the undertone of as long as nobody's hurt, really. So he cared about his people, he cared about his planet, he cared more about people not being injured or put into a slavery type of a situation, so to that I commend Lewis, because that was a great noble gesture on his part. But it's not the way that it plays out. So things heat up in between Jack and this Bordeaux I think that was his name, escalates to the point where the scientific facility the fleet had built is being destroyed, and Holly and Jack are there. There's this big monologue between Jack and the bad guy. Things are going to finally escalate to that explosion. They start just two people fighting against almost an entire army. Jack ends up running his mouth so much that the big baddie decides he's going to come down to eliminate Jack personally. Jack even admits that there's not ever any plans of there actually being a gunfight or a knife fight or anything like that. It just is what it is. Now, at this point, Holly and Jack come up with a plan. They blow up part of the facility to take out a lot of the bad guys. If you're looking at the sides here, they're all kind of bad guys. It's just how bad is the bad guy. It was the people that was against Holly and Jack is what I'm referring to as the bad guys here. And they blow them to pieces around the facility by blowing up the facility. And Jack is going to storm out, and he's going to try to reach an open air armor wearer and get that suit and then wreak as much havoc as he can, because surely he's going to die, and if they can hold it off until the fleet gets there to remedy the situation, awesome. On their second fight after this starts, that's whenever they get grabbed up by big bear paws, the both of them at the same time, dragged into a corridor. It was kind of weird because they started out inside and fought their way out, and then they ran into a whole lot of no, I don't want this, and then they start to head back in, but they get pulled in by this huge individual. Come to find out, it's Lewis. This was the part of the book kind of broke me a little bit. The reason why it broke me is because I can understand the plight. You'll see what I'm getting at here in a second if you haven't already figured it out. Lewis starts talking to Holly, and he doesn't exactly ignore Jack, but Jack becomes a bumbling idiot for some reason. The conversation is really focused between Lewis and Holly, and Lewis asks Holly very succinctly, as he's working on both Holly and Jack, trying to get them back to health to the point where they can stand, etc. He looks at Holly and he's like, is there no other way? I think at that point, if Holly didn't know, he figured it out right then and there. And he looks back at Lewis and he's like, no, there's no other way. This is a question that he asked 3 times. It's not going to be solved just on its own. There's no way out of the situation. There's no way to remedy the situation. And so Lewis strips down butt naked, walks over to the suit of armor or sitting in the wheelchair. So Lewis does a hard thing. He takes off all of his clothes and then he walks over to the suit of armor that Holly had tried to get into the bunker but was left in a wheelchair, puts his palm against the armor, and the armor lays itself out on the floor and opens up so that Lewis can get into it. This was when Jack figured out what was going on, that this Lewis that was such a lovable, likable character but not somebody to mess with was indeed Felix. I had kind of suspected and kind of had hoped, but I didn't see how that could have happened, because there was a point in the book where it was definitive that Felix, the one that couldn't just die, had been killed. Then the rest of the story that happens after that is quite phenomenal and brief, and I'm not going to give you the complete resolution of everything. What I'm getting at here is the story is fairly in-depth. There's more layers than just the rah, give me some, let's fight. There's a deeper component of, let's call Felix a paragon, because that's kind of what he is. Felix / Lewis gets into the suit of armor. He makes a couple comments about, I've let myself get out of shape. I wish I could have a cigarette in here. I really like the way that the book went. It was a enjoyable read. It's certainly worth your time. And there's a lot of other little components of moving pieces that were inside of the book that made it enjoyable as well. I recommend the book. Whenever I first picked up Armor, like I said, I set it to the side because it wasn't what I was looking for at that point, but I am so very glad that I did pick it back up to finish it. If I hadn't have, I wouldn't have found out about this lovable character Felix and his trials and tribulations and what he had to accept in order for him to move on with his life and his duties as an individual. And on that, we're going to end it. Like, share, subscribe. This is Shane from Shane's Books and Review. As always, I want to know what you think about the book. If you've read it, if you plan on reading it, let me know down there. And I will see you on Monday.